The jungle of Guadalcanal wakes up slowly. Dawn seeps through the trees as a gray-green haze. The air is heavy with mist and the smell of rotting leaves. Somewhere ahead, an unseen bird calls once, then falls silent, as if even the animals understand that this island belongs to war now. On a narrow trail hacked through the undergrowth, American soldiers move in single file, dark shapes against a darker wall of vegetation. Their boots sink into mud. Their helmets are beaded with moisture. Their rifles are clutched tight against their chests. Near the middle of the column walks a young officer, Second Lieutenant John B. George. To most of the men, he looks like any other junior officer. Lean and serious, face streaked with sweat and dirt, helmet pulled low over sharp eyes. But what sets him apart is not his rank or his expression, but the oddly shaped case slung over his shoulder. It's too slim to be a standard army weapon, too neat to be government issue. It looks more like something you'd see at a hunting lodge in Colorado than in a jungle on the far side of the world. Inside that case is a rifle that doesn't belong in any official table of organization. A commercial sporting rifle, the kind a civilian would buy through the mail from a catalog. A rifle that most military experts would dismiss as a toy beside the rugged service weapons carried by the rest of the battalion. Within a few weeks, this mail-order hunting rifle will rewrite everything the experts thought they knew about sniping in the Pacific. And it will help one young officer prove that real combat doesn't always follow the rules written in manuals. To understand why John George carried a civilian sporting rifle into one of the toughest battles of the Second World War, you have to step away from the jungle for a moment and go back to the United States before the war. George grew up in a country where rifles were part of ordinary life. In many American towns of the 1920s and 30s, weekend rifle matches were as common as baseball games. Range houses smelled of gun oil and coffee, and the crack of a .30 caliber bullet on a steel plate was as familiar as the sound of a church bell. From a young age, George lived in that world. He wasn't just someone who knew how to shoot, he was a serious marksman. By the time the war came, he had already spent years chasing tighter groups on paper targets and cleaner hits on game in the field. Every missed shot had been a lesson. Every competition had been a test. To him, a rifle wasn't just a military instrument. It was a personal tool. A good rifle had to fit your shoulder and your cheek. It had to balance in your hands so naturally that you didn't think about it. A good trigger broke like a glass rod. A good scope lined up with your eye the instant you mounted the stock. So when George joined the Illinois National Guard and then the wartime army, he carried more than a sense of duty. He carried a lifetime of practical experience. The officers who wrote doctrine talked about infantry in terms of formations and firepower. He thought about it in terms of what a single rifleman could do if he had the right weapon in his hands. Years before he ever saw Guadalcanal, George had made a decision that would follow him to the jungle. He took nearly 2 years of his modest guard pay and sent it off for a sporting rifle that he had studied in catalogs and on range talk for months. What arrived was a sleek bolt-action hunting rifle made by a civilian company. It wasn't a military Springfield, and it wasn't the new semi-automatic Garand. It was built for accuracy more than for mass production, with a carefully finished stock and a smooth action. The barrel and chamber were cut for precision, not speed on the assembly line. On top of it, he mounted a high-quality scope, a Lyman Alaskan, a civilian optic that many hunting guides swore by. Long before the Army truly standardized sniper optics, this scope gave him a bright, clear picture far beyond what normal infantrymen saw through their iron sights. He treated the rifle the way a craftsman treats his favorite tool. He learned exactly how far the bullet dropped at each distance, how it behaved in wind, how the scope looked in early morning light and just before dark. With that rifle and scope combination, he built an instinctive trust. When he pressed the trigger, he already knew where the bullet would land. To most people in uniform, this was just a hobby. To George, it was part of his idea of national defense. If war came, he believed America would need riflemen who could do more than fire into a general area of the enemy. He believed that one well-aimed shot at the right moment could matter more than a dozen hasty ones. The army that shipped men to the Pacific in 1942 had its own beliefs about rifles and combat. These beliefs had been shaped by the trenches of World War I and by peacetime training on neat ranges back home. In the official view, an infantry company won battles through volume of fire and maneuver. The standard service rifle was a heavy, sturdy weapon designed to be produced in huge numbers and to survive hard use. It was accurate enough for ordinary combat, where most shooting happened at short and medium ranges. The Army trusted diagrams and tables that said how units should place their fields of fire. Manuals were full of neat arrows and planned kill zones. Sniping in that world was still a specialized, almost old-fashioned art. Many officers thought of it as a rare skill, useful mainly for long-range harassment or for picking off enemy leaders on open terrain. Snipers were often imagined lying on bare hillsides or in ruined villages in Europe, where lines of sight stretched for hundreds of yards. On paper, the Pacific Theater didn't seem like a place where precision rifles would make much difference. Jungle fighting was supposed to be close and chaotic. Visibility would be limited. Ranges would be short. The assumption among many planners was that automatic weapons and grenades would matter far more than a single aimed shot. Besides, the Army already had standard rifles that it believed could fill any needed role. Special commercial weapons were seen as unnecessary complications. Even more than that, there was a cultural distrust of anything that smelled of the civilian world. Military men liked equipment that was government issue, stamped and approved. The idea that a private or a junior officer could show up with his own hunting rifle and claim that it was better than what the Ordnance Department provided rubbed many professionals the wrong way. When George sailed west toward the Solomon Islands, he knew all of this. He also knew something that the manuals didn't teach. As a hunter and match shooter, he understood that terrain and conditions could make precision marksmanship more important, not less. In the deep shade of a jungle, where the enemy appeared only for a second in a tiny gap, a clear scope and a known rifle might be the difference between seeing and missing, between surviving and dying. By the time George and the 132nd Infantry Regiment arrived on Guadalcanal in late 1942, the island had already become a symbol of the changing war in the Pacific. The United States had launched the campaign to stop Japanese expansion toward Australia. The Marines had seized the airfield, the Japanese tried to take it back, and the island turned into a grinding struggle of attrition. For months, men from both sides lived and died within a few miles of each other. They fought in dense jungle, on ridges, and along muddy streams. They battled not only each other but also malaria, dysentery, and a climate that rotted boots and grew mold on everything. When the American division, including the 132nd Infantry, relieved the exhausted Marines on the island, the fight was far from over. Japanese troops still held strong positions in the hills, including the complex defenses around Mount Austen, the Galloping Horse, and the Seahorse Ridges. This was the world into which George carried his strange-looking rifle case. For an infantry platoon leader, life on Guadalcanal meant long hours in foxholes and fire trenches, alert for sudden attacks. Japanese patrols slipped through the jungle at night. Snipers hid in trees and cleverly concealed bunkers, waiting days for a single shot. Here, the neat tables of fire from the training manuals proved almost useless. A machine gun that covered a perfect arc on paper might have its field of fire blocked by a single giant tree. In the day, the jungle felt strangely silent because you couldn't see the enemy. In the night, it was filled with sounds you couldn't identify. It was a place where theory broke down and individual skill and instinct took over. For John George and his mail-order rifle, the real test was about to begin. When George first showed his mail-order sporting rifle to his fellow officers and men, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect in a professional army. Some guys laughed. One man said it looked like a deer rifle, the kind of thing you took into the woods in November, not into a war against the Japanese Empire. Others worried it wasn't rugged enough for the jungle mud and rain. They pointed to their own service rifles, which had been tested by ordnance officers under harsh conditions, and argued that anything else was unproven. Among the more conservative officers, there was also a sense that this civilian rifle offended the natural order of things. The Army issued weapons. The Army tested weapons. The Army knew what was best. A junior officer showing up with his own idea of what he needed sounded dangerously close to questioning that system. George listened to all the opinions. Then he quietly did what serious craftsmen always do. He went to the range and proved his point with results. Side by side with standard rifles, his sporting rifle produced tighter groups. It allowed for fast follow-up shots despite being a bolt action, because the smooth action and familiar stock made cycling the bolt almost automatic. Through the scope, targets that had looked like dark smudges through iron sights suddenly became clear shapes. You could see not just a head and shoulders, but a patch of cloth or the curve of a helmet rim. He didn't pretend his rifle was perfect. It held fewer rounds than some semi-automatic rifles, and it required careful handling. But in his hands, it was an exact instrument. He wasn't asking every soldier to carry one. He was saying that on a battlefield where a single hidden sniper could hold up an entire company, there was room for a specialist with a tool designed for that specific job. If the American experts had underestimated anything on Guadalcanal, it was the psychological and tactical power of a skilled sniper hidden in the jungle. Japanese units made aggressive use of such men. Soldiers with good fieldcraft and patience dug themselves into trees or hollowed out roots. They tied themselves in place so they wouldn't fall from branches. They used natural foliage and carefully chosen angles. The dense vegetation worked in their favor. A small opening between leaves might give them a clear shot at an American path while hiding them completely from return fire. A single Japanese sniper could pin down a squad for hours. Each time a man moved from cover, there was a crack, and another soldier fell. Sometimes the shooter couldn't be located at all. The Americans knew only that somewhere out there, past the wall of green, was an eye staring through a sight, waiting. Standard responses to this threat were often clumsy and costly. Machine guns sprayed entire tree lines. Grenades were hurled into suspicious thickets. Men fired wildly into the canopy, hoping to hit something. The jungle just absorbed most of this desperate fire. What the Americans needed was not more bullets, but precise ones. They needed a way to find that tiny flicker of movement or the disguised notch of a firing slit and place a single, accurate shot into it. That was exactly the kind of problem that George and his rifle were made for. The first time George truly justified his decision to bring the sporting rifle was not in a competition or on a range. It happened in the middle of an ordinary, tense patrol. His unit was moving through secondary jungle along a shallow creek. The heat was thick enough to feel. The air barely moved. Men stepped carefully, eyes scanning for tripwires and signs of dug-in positions. Above them, the canopy formed an uneven ceiling. Leaves shook from time to time as birds landed and took off. The first shot came from nowhere. It was a flat, cracking sound, followed an instant later by the dull thud of a bullet hitting flesh. A man near the front of the column went down, clutching his shoulder. Dirt kicked up near another soldier's boot. Someone shouted, "Sniper!" And everyone hit the ground, whether there was cover or not. In that first frozen minute, the old habits surfaced. Several men pointed their rifles toward the general direction of the shot and fired short bursts into the trees. A light machine gun began to chatter, shredding leaves from branches, but the enemy remained unseen. George forced himself to stay calm. This was the exact situation that had lived in his mind when he decided to haul an expensive civilian rifle halfway around the world. He eased the sporting rifle from its case, slid behind a low rise of earth, and brought the scope up to his eye. The world narrowed at once. Instead of a wall of indistinct green, he saw slices of space between trunks, branches, and vines. He moved the crosshairs slowly, methodically. He looked for anything that didn't quite belong an unnatural straight line. A darker patch in the bark of a tree, a small rectangular shadow in a tangle of leaves, and there it was. A tiny, darker oval just below a fork in a tree. A few inches of bamboo that looked too smooth to be natural. He realized he was seeing the muzzle of a rifle protruding from a hollow. He didn't shout. He didn't point and risk warning the sniper. Instead, he settled his breathing, let the world slow down, and pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked gently against his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the small dark shape jerk and then disappear. A moment later, a figure tumbled from a hidden perch and crashed through the branches to the ground. Silence followed, then a cautious cheer from the men who had watched the body fall. The firing stopped. The patrol moved again. For them, this was just one more frightening encounter in the jungle. For George and for his unusual rifle, it was a proof of concept. Just as he had believed, the combination of a trusted sporting rifle and a good optic had solved a problem that sheer volume of fire could not. Word spread quickly through the battalion. Men talk in war, constantly, about weapons, about what works and what fails. They share stories of jammed submachine guns, of grenades that roll back from wet ground, of rifles that rust overnight in the tropical rain. Within days, the tone of the conversations around George changed slightly. The mocking comments about deer rifles turned into questions. How far can you see with that scope? How well does it hold zero in the rain? How many clicks do you need to adjust for 200 yards in this humidity? Some officers still frowned at the non-standard weapon, but even they couldn't ignore results. When you're responsible for the lives of your men, success has a way of melting pride. The fact that a mail-order sporting rifle had just outperformed official doctrine in a live-fire situation was not something they could easily dismiss. As the fighting around Mount Austen and the neighboring ridges intensified, the Japanese sniper threat grew even more serious. The rugged hills above the American positions were laced with bunkers, caves, and firing points carefully chosen to cover approaches. The defenders knew the terrain intimately. They had months to prepare. For American troops climbing those slopes, each tree and each hollow could hide a rifle barrel. A man who raised his head too high over cover might never get a second chance. This was the environment in which George and his rifle would face their sternest test. Accounts from the period describe a remarkable series of days in which he hunted Japanese snipers as deliberately as a skilled hunter stalks dangerous game. Instead of waiting for the enemy to fire first, he used his scope's advantage to search them out in their lairs. Each morning, he would study the terrain in front of the lines. He looked for patterns, not just single clues. If a particular patch of jungle remained strangely still when artillery fell around it, there might be a dug-in position. If a trail of trampled foliage stopped short of the front, there might be a hidden observation post nearby. He often worked with observers and other soldiers who had survived close calls. They would point to areas where shots had come from before. Together, they built a map of likely sniper nests. Then George would settle behind his rifle and begin the patient work of watching. And in that deadly chess match, the hunter had become the hunted. Imagine this. One intense period on Guadalcanal, a single soldier eliminates 11 enemy snipers in just 4 days. Each one was a deadly duel of wits and nerves. A flash of light on glass, a faint change in the outline of a log, these were the tiny clues that gave away a hidden enemy. And after every single shot, he had to move, knowing the enemy was learning his habits, just as he was learning theirs. What mattered most was that each enemy sniper removed was one less unseen rifle tormenting the American companies below. The effect on morale was huge. Men who had been too afraid to even peek out of their foxholes began to trust that someone was out there watching over them. But why was this soldier, John George, so effective? It wasn't magic. It was his rifle, a civilian sporting rifle he'd bought through a mail-order catalog. And it held several practical advantages that standard military thinking had overlooked. First, the quality. The barrel and the action of his rifle gave him consistent accuracy far beyond what most service rifles could offer, especially after being dragged through jungle mud and humidity. He knew exactly how that rifle would behave at different ranges, and he could rely on that knowledge under the immense stress of combat. Second, the scope. A good hunting scope is designed to pull detail out of dim forests at dawn and dusk. Well, those were the exact conditions of much of the fighting on Guadalcanal. Under the thick jungle canopy, even midday felt like twilight. Through that superior glass, George could see what others couldn't. Third, and just as important, was his complete familiarity with the weapon. He had practiced with it for years. Every motion was automatic. The stock fit his shoulder, his hand, and his cheek perfectly. This meant less conscious effort went into handling the weapon, freeing up precious mental space for the delicate task of spotting and interpreting the tiny life-or-death signs of the enemy. In contrast, many American soldiers were using weapons that looked impressive on paper but were flawed in practice. Some submachine guns, like the Rising, earned a terrible reputation in the mud and grit of the Pacific. They jammed the moment dirt got into their complicated mechanisms, and their magazines were fragile. Standard rifles were reliable enough, but they rarely matched the fine-tuned accuracy of a well-made sporting gun paired with a top-quality optic. And above all, none of them came with the kind of personal bond that George had forged with his rifle over years of civilian use. By bringing that rifle into battle, he had ignored the conventional wisdom that said every soldier should carry the same government-issue weapon. Instead, he followed the quiet logic known to every serious craftsman: choose the tool that does the job and know it better than anyone else. Now, nothing in a large organization like the military changes overnight. But combat has its own brutal way of testing ideas. In the weeks following George's success, his presence on the line became something commanders actively factored into their operations. If a unit was being tormented by a particularly troublesome sniper, they'd ask if the lieutenant with the sporting rifle could be spared for a day. If a new sector was being probed, they tried to place him where his unique skills would have the greatest effect. Some officers began to encourage more flexible attitudes toward weapons. Men who qualified as sharpshooters were sometimes given access to scopes and allowed to customize their rifles within certain limits. The old assumption that one rifle fits all roles started to slowly erode under the relentless pressure of battlefield experience. This didn't mean the Army suddenly threw away its doctrine or ordered thousands of commercial hunting rifles. But it did mean that field commanders grew more willing to adapt. That willingness would help shape later sniper programs and influence how the Army thought about precision fire in jungle terrain. In the quieter moments behind the lines, George's rifle attracted a mix of curiosity and awe. It became part of the small unit mythology that grows in every combat zone. Men would ask to look through the scope, marveling at how clear a distant tree line appeared. They'd weigh the rifle in their hands, feeling the smoothness of the bolt, the perfect balance of the stock. Some would quietly ask how much a rifle like that cost back home, storing away the idea for a future when they might return and buy one of their own. At the same time, the rifle was no magic talisman. It had to be cleaned constantly. The jungle tried to reclaim it daily. Moisture crawled into every metal surface, fungus threatened the wood, and oil had to be reapplied after every single patrol. George is often described as treating these chores not as burdens, but as a ritual, a way of maintaining the relationship between man and tool. Each time he disassembled the rifle and wiped down its parts, he was reinforcing why he had brought it and what it had allowed him to do. One of the most important aspects of George's story is the psychological impact of his precision fire. For American troops pinned down by a hidden sniper, hopelessness can creep in fast. The enemy seems invisible, untouchable. Every movement feels like a gamble. A single unseen rifle controls the behavior of dozens of men. That is a corrosive feeling in combat. But when word passes that a skilled marksman is actively hunting those snipers, that feeling changes. Men still fear the next shot, But they also know the threat isn't one-sided. Somewhere out there, a friendly rifle is at work, answering the invisible enemy with its own silent search. On the Japanese side, the effect is reversed. Their snipers were trained to expect that once they were well hidden, they could fire many shots before being discovered. Facing someone like George completely disrupted that assumption. Suddenly, 1 or 2 shots might be all they got before a counter-sniper located them. That knowledge adds a sharp edge of uncertainty, even to the most determined soldier. It forces more caution, a slower rate of fire, and less exposure. All of that reduces the overall effectiveness of the enemy snipers. In this way, a single precise rifle can have an effect far broader than just the number of enemies it kills. It shapes behavior on both sides of the battlefield. After Guadalcanal, the war in the Pacific moved on. New American units learned their own bitter lessons about jungle fighting. The Marine Corps and the Army both expanded their use of snipers, and designated marksmen were equipped with scoped rifles based on military designs. Yet the core lesson of George's mail-order rifle remained. The battlefield wasn't a static classroom where one set of approved tools and tactics worked everywhere. It was a shifting, complicated environment where the insights of individuals could save lives and alter the course of small but significant actions. The man who was once teased for carrying a deer rifle to war later wrote a detailed book about his experiences. In its pages, the same spirit appears again and again, a willingness to question assumptions and measure everything against the unforgiving standard of real combat. Looking back, it is easy to say the experts who dismissed a civilian sporting rifle were simply prisoners of their own experience. They had seen one kind of war and prepared for its repetition. What they hadn't fully grasped was how different the Pacific theater would be. Under the jungle canopy, fighting became small-scale, intimate, and often decided by who could see first and shoot straighter. In that deadly duel, the qualities prized by civilian hunters, a bright scope, a reliable action, and a deep understanding of terrain suddenly became central. The experts weren't wrong to value standardization and ruggedness. Those things are essential, but they underestimated the value of specialized tools in special situations. For all of us today, George's story offers several enduring lessons. It reminds us that wars are fought not just with equipment chosen in distant offices, but with the personal skills and judgments of individual soldiers. It shows that innovation at the front isn't always new technology. Sometimes it's just applying existing tools in a new context. And it underlines that doctrine must always be tested against reality. The battlefield will always generate surprises, and the armies that adapt quickly are the ones that succeed. Let's return one last time to that narrow jungle trail on Guadalcanal. The sun is lower now, with shadows stretching long between the trees. A patrol halts. George wipes condensation from the lens of his scope and looks out into the green darkness. His rifle rests easily against his shoulder, no longer a curiosity or a joke, but a trusted part of his unit's survival. Somewhere out ahead, another sniper may be watching. But this time, the Americans have a hunter of their own. In his hands, a simple, mail-order sporting rifle has become something far larger. Proof that on the real battlefield, the right tool in the right hands can change everything. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into military history.